Well, good evening. Sorry I'm running just a little bit behind. I had someone from my work call me at 6:15 and ask me to fix something. So we're going to be in Esther 2 tonight. We're going to review what we talked about on Sunday and then finish up the chapter here in just a moment. Let me get turned to it. Okay, before we start, we're going to go ahead and say a prayer for our study. Let's pray. Oh Lord, we thank you so much for this wonderful day you gave us. We thank you for the things you've provided to us. We thank you for our jobs and for our homes, our families, our friends. We thank you for the church and what it does for us. We pray that we would grow in our love for you each day and that we would learn to be more like your Son. We thank you for your word and what it teaches us, and we pray tonight that as we all study your word in the many different classes, that we would do so to the best of our ability and that we would give it the respect that it deserves. We love you, and we pray that those who have prepared things tonight to teach would do so, would teach in a well manner and would remember the things that they prepared. We love you so much, and we thank you for the sacrifice of Christ on the cross for our sins, and it's through him we thank you and we pray. Amen. First thing, I think I need to lower this a little bit. Up, down, up. Okay. Is that better? That's better. Okay. So like I said, we're in chapter 2. And we read the chapter on Sunday. We finished up chapter 1 and read the chapter on Sunday. So we will touch on what we touched on, and then we'll probably reread some of the sections that we read on Sunday. So let's just go ahead and, I'll just review my notes. So we talked about at the beginning of Esther chapter 2. Go ahead and just get here. So we talked about this section. We talked about how all of this would have happened in the time of King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes the first, which would have been during 486 to 465 BC, sometime in that frame. In the first chapter, the big feast that's held was held in the third year of his reign, so it would have been 483 BC. And then in the seventh year of his reign, we see close to the end of chapter 2, was where Esther was crowned queen. So we know that all this stuff that happens in chapter 2 happens sometime between the third and the seventh year, most likely around the sixth or seventh year, because in other historical accounts we see that King Xerxes was off at war until about 480 BC, which would have been the seventh year of his reign, or sixth year of his reign, excuse me. We talked about how these women were sought, gathered, and put under the custody of Haggai, who was one of the eunuchs that watched over the women here. And it doesn't appear that they were really given a choice to participate in all this. They were kind of brought and gathered almost like livestock. Very saddening situation. We can see a similar example in 2 Samuel 11. We didn't bring this up on Sunday, but I do think it's a good illustration. 2 Samuel 11 is, of course, the account of David and Bathsheba and David's sin. And in 2 Samuel 11, we see that King David, in verse 4, it says, David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her. So it wasn't he went and requested her to come, it was he took her and brought her into his presence. So we can see just a totally different treatment of women compared to where we are today. Okay, and then we talked about verses 5 through 8.
Can I bring up
Yeah. Gerald's got a point. Sorry, I didn't see you.
This is actually a Brad comment, so I'm going to make Brad's comment for him. But there in chapter 2, verse 1, the remember. I think it's interesting, the text that brings that out. And he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he decreed against her. You know, I'm not sure what he remembered, but and if Brad wants to talk about it, it's almost if he might have remembered what he had done, good or bad. But it's interesting here that the text says that he remembered her, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
to me.
it almost implies that he had forgotten her at one point, or that it may not have had such significance, and all of a sudden he remembered his actions. I guess that's what I take from it. But in verses 5 through 8, we see this is where Mordecai is introduced along with Esther. And we talked about how Mordecai was introduced as a son of Kish and a Benjaminite, which would have related him with, if we look at Saul was also a Benjaminite and a son of Kish. So we can see a parallel to the story of the struggle with the Amalekites. On top of that, we also talked about how it says that he was carried away from Jerusalem among the captives. Something interesting about that, I did some more studying on that between Sunday and today. And something interesting about that is there's many people who believe that. So how it says in verse 5, you can see up there, it says, son of Jair, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. So it's almost... many people believe, and I'm tending to believe this as well, that he was actually, Jair was his father, Shimei was his grandfather, and Kish was his great-grandfather, and Kish would have been the one who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives. It's not really clear based on what's given here, and that makes more sense given the amount of time that would have passed, 100 years, because otherwise we could read it as Mordecai being 100 years or maybe more like 30. Either way, we don't know. This is what we've got, so it's not too critically important here. And then we see that Esther is brought up, and her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. We talked about that in the intro class, and that means it's like a shrub that was a beautiful shrub. And we saw that in the text, we see that Mordecai was her caretaker because both of her parents had died, and he was the one who was now taking care of her. Okay, and this is about where we left off. Any questions up till now in this chapter? I didn't mean to cut you off, Gerald. I hope I wasn't trying to do that. So, okay. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay. So as we saw, along with, and we see at the end of this section, along with the first part of the chapter where we saw the women being taken, we also see here in verse 8, close to the end, it says, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. So it says, Esther was gathered just like the other women and taken. So given the things we know about the Persians and their attitudes towards women, it's hard for us to see how this might have gone down. This is not like modern day. I think, how many people in here have seen The Bachelor before? No one? No one? Absolutely no one. Okay. Well, I've seen it, believe it or not. And you've seen it? Okay, Brad's seen it. Good. Me and Brad. Okay. Well, this is not The Bachelor. They're not trying to win the rose here. This is a competition where they've been brought in, and now the king's just going to find the woman that he likes best. And I guess what I'm saying by that is they're not looking to. This wasn't a voluntary contest where they came in and trying to win the queenship or anything like that. They were brought in. And Brad, you had something. Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah, Daryl's coming.
we don't know how many there were brought.
Yeah.
I would assume many.
Yeah.
I mean, just an assumption. But I would venture to say, and I mean, this is just, there probably were a few of them that wanted
Oh yeah,
to
I'm
be
sure.
the queen.
Yeah.
There would be, because there's only an opening for one person.
Yeah.
Well, however many there were, the rest of them were going to be losers. But it was serious business with them too. There were consequences after the fact. If you were one of these women who were taken, the consequence of that is if you were not picked to be the queen, you would never ever again. You would not be able to marry. You would be put over here in another group, and so you were giving up a whole lot. That's serious. Think about that. even though times are different, just from a human standpoint, think of the human standpoint from that. Even if we were to have to do that today, that's a big deal. Even back then, that was a big deal for them. I mean, there are consequences of that. And that plays a part in this, just of how things were. There was only one young woman, you know, and remember, it was not a young bachelor that, you know,
right.
Well, I don't know what he looked like, but he wasn't a young man.
And he had other wives too, so it wasn't like he was a single guy.
He was older than he was younger.
Yeah.
So he may not have had them hunky muscles, you know, hair just right. It had color in it like yours. I mean, he wouldn't have looked like that.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, that of course they were trying to win, because the alternative was that they were stuck in this, you know, for lack of a better word, house for women until they died. And they were married to the king, but if the king didn't call them, they just stayed there. It's a sad situation. So we see that Haggai had charge of the women here. We get the impression, based on how it reads, if you see, I guess it was in the previous passage, but it says in verse 8, it says, young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, and then Esther was also put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. So it's almost as if he was already in this position before all this happened. He had charge of these women. We don't really know, but it seems as if his position, it wasn't necessarily created for this contest. These women were just brought in, and he was already there taking charge of women. So, any questions on this? Brad, go ahead.
What Gerald's talking about in verse 1, the reason I think about that like that is, let's think about from the human standpoint again. These are real people. This really happened. You know, we're real people. We're living life. And if you're the king, I mean, let's look at it from a man's standpoint. You're the king, and you've made this decree where your queen, you've basically made it where, you know, she's gone.
Yep.
You know, and that's why that word remembered, it's not just, oh, I remember that I like ice cream. It's not that remembered. It's remembered.
Yeah.
And that sounds the same. But it's remembered. You know, I cannot help but believe that, like I said, he was not a young man. And his compatriots, his buddies, if you will, if we're in today's day and time, you know, if it were Gerald and me and you, and this is us in this situation, and we're telling you, hey, John, well, let's make it me since I'm over. And you two guys are telling me, hey, Brad, hey, what you need is, which that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
You know, they're telling you what you need. I'm listening to y'all, and y'all are giving me foolish information, and you're saying, hey, you need a bunch of these younger women out here, and that'll take your mind off of, but I'm remembering, you know, and I'm human, and I'm a man, and I'm thinking, that is what I need. I need some of them younger women.
Yeah.
You know, I'm that foolish, and you all are on my side and saying, go ahead, you know, go ahead, this is what you need, this is what we need to do.
Yeah. None of these men were opposed to it.
But I'm the king, and I'm remembering, hey, look what I've done.
Yep.
And look what I've done to my queen. When we look at it like that, then you know what? It becomes more real to us. Mm-hmm. And how many of us have been in that situation where we listen to those people around us, and because y'all are on my side, you're looking out for my best interest, you know, or at least we think so. Mm-hmm. But really it ain't. I'll be quiet.
No, you're good. Thank you for your comments. That's a great.
That's what he's talking
Yeah,
about.
oh yeah.
When I talk about remember, I just think I want to know what was going through his head.
Yeah.
When we get to heaven, we're going to know. we can know, we can ask what was going,
What did that mean?
in
Yeah.
that story, what were you remembering? It wasn't that you liked ice cream. It was more than that. The Word says more to us than that.
Great point. Thank you for your comments. All right, we'll move on to verse 9 through 11. Okay, and it says, "And the young women pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics." And the young woman, that's Esther, pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Okay, so we see here that Esther manages to win Haggai's favor. We don't really know what that means, but it sounds like basically Haggai liked her and maybe she was a nice person, maybe she was kind, we don't really know. She could have been a skilled musician, a singer, a dancer, any of those things that we know that were in the harem. We just know that Haggai approves of her and he gives her a better place to live and better food. So this could mean that she got more food than everybody else. We don't know. It's interesting that it's called out the way it is because it almost sounds as if everyone else didn't get the same treatment she got, which would have meant that she probably got more food and a better place to live. Yeah, Gerald?
She kind of reminds me of me. When I walk in a room, everybody really likes me, usually when no. But she seems to be, when you read here and you also read the meeting with the king, is that she's that person, and we know people like that. When they walk in a room and you talk to them for a few minutes, they're just really likable, like you like them. Like they just kind of have this likability, whether it's their smile or how they talk or how they act or their character or whatever it is. But it seems that she has those traits. Like when she's in front of people or when she's with somebody. I mean, was it 10 people in the harem? Was it 100? Was it 1,000? Was it 10,000? However many it was, she immediately stood out and was extremely likable to him. And I find that really, really cool and really a strong characteristic of hers, because we see this mentioned about her twice, that when she's in the presence of people, people like her. And I think that's really, really cool about her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's verse 15, what you're talking about.
You say that's in verse 15? Yeah. We also notice in this section, we talked about some of the comparisons you can make. As we see here, she's among the king's court. She receives portions of food. And it's interesting just to note that we see the same type thing in Daniel, but the people, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, don't take the king's food. It could have been that the food was different. We don't really know. It's just an interesting comparison here, that she accepts the portions of food, and it could just be that she got more food than everybody else. We don't really know. It's just an interesting comparison. It could have been within the constraints of the Jewish diet, but we don't really know. At this point, we also see that in verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred because Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So why did Mordecai implore Esther to keep her people or kindred secret? That's the question. It's possible that this is a rational fear of the king. So some of the research that I did talked about how King Cyrus and King Darius both kept peace with the Babylonians. This is just to show their relations with other nations and the different things that they did. King Xerxes and King Darius kept peace with the Babylonians once they conquered them, but Xerxes, upon his ascension to the throne, did not find the customs which Cyrus and Darius took to keep peace with his people worth his time. So basically, he thought he was the master of the universe, and he didn't really care what these people thought. He did not find the people in Babylon began to revolt, and after doing this twice, Xerxes attacked the city and crushed the rebellion of the people there, melted their idols, and so it's possible that Mordecai saw all this and saw how much hatred he had against other people. I don't really know. But seeing and hearing of these events and seeing his attitudes towards other religious acts, maybe would have been a reason that he said not to do that. We don't really know. A couple other things to note about this. We talked about how Haggai's favor was won, and that gave Esther the best place in the harem. I don't really know what that means. Maybe she got a better room. I don't really know. And she got 7 people to attend to her. And then we talked about Mordecai's commandment just a moment ago. Another interesting fact is Mordecai's position here, as it's mentioned in verse 11. It says, every day he walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So we see it a couple different times throughout the whole book, more than a couple. Mordecai mentioned walking at the gate or being at the gate of the city. This could have been that he was a government official. It could have indicated that he was a government official. We know based on Babylonian history that that's where the king's officials would have been. Some of them would have been at the gate. So it's possible that that was his position. It would explain why he was always at the gate, but he could have also just been checking up on all the latest news about Esther. We don't really know. So,
John,
yeah, Gerald.
if somebody takes my daughter, my little girl, I'm going to check on her every day. I'm going to make sure she's taken care of. He took her as his daughter, and I'm sure he loved her very much. And I can imagine that he wanted to make sure that nothing bad was happened to her. I mean, and I can't imagine it being anything else but that. I mean, checking every day to make sure that nothing bad was happened to her, that he could do. Now, and I just say that because she was his daughter, and I'm sure he loved her, and that just makes sense.
Yeah, that's possible. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get into 12 through 16. It says, now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So right there at the end, that's where we see what we were talking about earlier, the 7th year of the king's reign, which would have been 479 BC. Okay, so some of the things that we see here, we see what seems like a purification period in verses 12. In verse 12, it talks about this beautifying process, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments. Myrrh oil, some of the purposes of myrrh oil were for fragrance, embalming, flavoring of food, so they would eat it, treating of hay fever, an antiseptic to clean wounds, as a paste to help stop bleeding and different things like that. So there, who knows what these women would have looked like coming in off the streets. A lot of things I was thinking about as I was preparing for this is we have a lot of medicines and things like that we can put on our skin to clean up wounds and things like that, and they wouldn't necessarily have had those things readily available at that time. I don't know, maybe it was to help purify and clean the skin. We don't really know. This is what we've got. So 6 months with spices and ointments. In a society, kind of like what I just said, in a society where skincare is a common commodity here, it could have just been mainly for skincare, moisturizers, creams, things like that. We don't really know. It could have been something else. I'm not too sure. So it seems, though, that they took a whole year to do this. So it's difficult to tell what went on. We just know that they, did some kind of purification. Then the next thing we see, we have a comment. I'm sorry.
I know when our friend, we all know Curie Benson, before she was married, I know in India, one of the things that they would do with preparation of the bride was they would cover her in turmeric and different spices. It was just something in their culture that they did to prepare the bride for the groom. It was something to beautify, to smell good. It was just something to make them look better. And so we see that still in today's time. In different parts of the country, that's what they do.
Interesting. We should probably start talking before we... Yeah, that was interesting. So she said that in Indian culture, they put spices and things on the bride before the wedding. I guess it's possible that could happen in other cultures as well, other than the Indian culture. And it could even be that this happened back in that time. We don't really know.
John, I had to do that before Stephanie would marry me.
Gerald said he had to do that before Stephanie would marry him. Okay, so then the next thing that we see is this night with the king. We see they went in to the king in the evening, and they returned to a different harem in the morning. And after they return to a different harem, they're placed in the harem with other concubines. So these would have been people who had sexual intercourse with the king. It's important to keep in mind that this situation is described in a way that doesn't necessarily show approval for what's happening. It's just describing what's happening. I just lost my spot in my notes. So she's now, kind of like Brad was alluding to earlier, she is now one of the king's wives. Regardless of what else she had planned for her life, this is now her life. She's inside the harem, and she's now stuck in the king's palace as a slave wife. She is to be monogamous with the king, while the king can be as polygamous as he wants with all the women that he has. As we see the situation unfolding, we sometimes think of this as I'm getting lost in my notes, sorry, just a moment.
John, I do find it interesting.
Yeah, Gerald's got a point.
It says
Dale.
that she was taken to the palace. And I read through this about 20 times, and I found that interesting that it says that she was taken to the palace, and that's kind of where it leaves it. Asherus into his royal palace. And I don't know about y'all, but I imagine this palace probably wouldn't, one or two rooms. I imagine if it was his home, it probably was a huge mansion of some sort he lived in. And, and it says she was taken to the palace, and then she went there that morning, and she left that next night. So that's kind of all the text tells us there beyond that.
Well, yeah, and then it says, in verse 12, it says they would go into the king. So they'd be in the king's presence for the night, and that was a primary role of these people in the harem, was to entertain the king during parties and during the night. So whatever that would have been, we don't really know, but we just know about the culture and what the text says here. And then we see, like we talked about, that they were transferred into the harem with the concubines afterwards, which would have been the women who were almost lesser wives. These women that have been captured and are now the king's wives, maybe not as beautiful or as elegant as other women. As sad as it is, that's the way they did things. So it was just a horrible situation we see here. And we see that in verse... Sorry, I'm in the next section. That's what I'm thinking of, sorry. So it's interesting to note and to keep this in mind that this whole situation, whatever's going on, Esther is not portrayed as a good moral example in this situation. And I don't think she's meant to be portrayed as a good moral example. We just have what the text tells us, and this should encourage us to see God and see God in this story and see how these people are brought through these horrible circumstances through the power of God. Because as we've talked about, she's a woman who's been taken into this harem, And now she's trying to win her spot as king, or as queen, excuse me, and it's just a horrible situation. I got a lot of notes on this section. I just want to make sure I covered everything.
Where does it say that she was trying to win her spot? She was chosen.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean it the way that sounded. Sorry. I more just meant she's in this situation now where she's been placed in such a horrible situation, and she has two choices. And what her motivation is, I don't know. We just know that she was picked to win the queenship, and that the alternative was that she would be a slave wife for the rest of her life in the king's harem.
Mordecai, I think in verse 20, was kind of commanded her and leading her by what I
In verse 20, he said, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she brought him up. We can see, like I said, we don't really know what Esther's motives were here, but we just know that she won the queenship. Gerald's got a comment.
I don't know that Esther has any motives, period. Esther's taken. Esther here has had a year here to do what she's been told to do. Esther is taken to the palace. We don't know what happened. The text clearly says that here. And then she was doing what she's been told the whole time. So to say that Esther has any motives, there's no text here for her motives at all, except for she's doing what she's been told to do the whole time. And we see that by her doing that and spending time with the king, he delights in her just like other people have in the past, and she becomes queen. That's what we have in the text.
Yep. Thanks. I think my thoughts are a little jumbled, so I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm not trying to, yeah. Okay. So we see, as we talked about just a moment ago, and this isn't working. Jason, do you mind going to the next? Let me just try it. Okay, there we go. Esther has growing favor, as we talked about. She's, as it says in verse 15, at the end of verse 15, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Like we said earlier, it could have been that she was just a nice person. We don't really know. She was a likable person, kind of like what Gerald said.
John?
Yeah, Brad.
In verse 15, and Gerald referenced this earlier, in verse 15 where it talks about it, where it says that, and I mean, you wonder why we're given that information. It says she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, had advised, and Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So she found favor in all. It wasn't, it was all encompassing. Now, we know from the second verse, there weren't any of these women that had three eyes. They were all beautiful, even though they had to have all that stuff.
Yeah.
They were eating and rubbing on themselves and all that, And each one of us has an idea in our mind what that looked like. But they were all beautiful. We know that from what it tells us. But what it tells us right there is she didn't ask for anything. And I'll tell you what that means in my mind. And this is going to sound silly, but I dated an old girl one time. One time. Here's a dating lesson, Gerald. You don't need this, but if any of you in here need one, you're going to get it. One time. And I did not marry her, Gerald. Oh, was that?
That was Dale.
Quit that, Dale. But you know what? I took her to a nice dinner. Don't matter where it was, but it was nice. It wasn't a hamburger, And she complained about everything. And I had asked her to dinner and to a movie. And I mean, the croutons were too hard, and the dressing was too this, and that was too that, and this was our first date. And you know, when I got her back in the car, I drove as fast as I could drive back to her apartment. I can take you this day over and show you where I dumped her out at over to her apartment. And there wasn't no movie after that. She was a complainer. And I know the poor old boy that married her, you know, and she never got no better. So I was thankful that, you know, I wasted a good dinner on that girl. But to say that, that's what that says to me.
She wasn't like that.
This old girl
Yeah.
here didn't ask for nothing.
Yeah.
She was content, and that says something. I mean, that says something to us. If we're sitting there as, hey, we're the king, and you know, we remembered all this stuff we did, and now, hey, why? I don't know why, but we know she had favor. Well, you know, she was one that had favor with everybody. You know, if we're talking, and I wish everybody had seen. I wouldn't recommend you to watch The Bachelor, but if you'd seen it, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
Now, you don't
Let's
see
be
no,
clear.
there's no dogs on there.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
there are, but you know, there's no girls with 3 eyes on there. There's just not. They don't pass, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and they're all smiling and they're nice and they don't complain. I don't assume, because they're wanting to win. But she's just like there's going to be one person chosen, one beautiful person chosen, and she had something. She had that inner beauty. She wasn't just beautiful on the outside, and we all know people like that. Like Gerald was talking about. You know, when you meet them, I mean, they're good people. You want them as salespeople, because when they come in, you know what, man, I'm gonna buy if I need it or not. You know what I'm saying? Not because they're beautiful. It may be because they're concerned about everybody else. They're not concerned about themselves. They're not concerned about what their wants and needs are. Yeah. She didn't ask for nothing, period. And that means something. I mean, that little bitty, just those few words there, it means something to us. And it's real.
Yep. Yeah, Don.
I was thinking about when it says that she found favor in kind of the way that Joseph did. He was in a situation he didn't have any choice, and he made the best of it, and he showed his inner self. And I see that in Esther. It doesn't say so, but that she was making the best of a bad situation she was in and trying to, like Brad said, trying to show that she was a decent person.
Yeah. Great comparison, Jim. Yeah. Jim's got a comment as well.
Possibility too that all the other maidens or whatever you want to call them, they were most likely idol worshipers.
Yeah.
Esther was probably not because of the Jewish, and obviously she was smarter than them. I mean, that's a plain way of putting it. He saw something different in her and her beauty, and she stood out. And I think maybe that had something to do with it too. She was different from the rest of them. They were idol worshipers. There was no doubt.
Yeah. Sorry, Sarah's got a comment back here.
And just listening to the comments, yes, Esther was chosen by the king, but we can't forget it was God who chose Esther.
Yeah,
And
great
in all
point.
of this,
Great point.
in Gerald's point of motives, I agree. I don't see any motives on Esther's part. I just see God's providence working here, and we'll see later. God's will is going to be carried out whether Esther does the job or not. But God knew she would.
And that kind of brings me to this quote that I found I think is great. It says, "Is there any man so blind as not to perceive that it was entirely providential that one of the small number of captive Jews should be found more beautiful than all the virgins of 127 provinces? Can anyone question that God gave her that exquisite loveliness for this very occasion?" Kind of like you just said, this is the hand of God at work here, that she was picked out of everyone in Persia. Okay, so we got to finish up this chapter here in about 10 minutes. Okay, so the next section says, "The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Okay, so some things that we see here. We see that the king loved her more than everyone else. He loved her so much that he picks her to be the queen instead of Vashti. It's interesting to note that it says she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he obviously loved her very much here. The word that's used there for love is ahab, which says to have affection for, so sexually or otherwise. So we just know that he loved Esther here, and it's, yeah. So then, as we've talked about in the first few chapters of the book, first, I guess, 2 chapters of the book, we've seen a lot of feasts. And here we see yet another feast. The king hosts a feast for Esther and all his officials and servants. It sounds as if the scope of this feast would have just been the people within the palace based on the way it's worded. So maybe he was just a welcoming of the queen into the palace. We don't, as the official queen, we don't really know. It says he granted a remission of taxes here. We don't, I guess maybe a better word here that is that he gave the people a holiday almost, like they didn't have to pay taxes for this period of time. And just kind of like a break from taxes. Just interesting to see that. And then in verses 19 and 20, we see that Mordecai is brought up again. And yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just going to make a comment, just the difference between these 2 verses versus the very beginning where it talks about how Ahasuerus did all these things to show his greatness, and it was throwing a feast for everyone. And then the attitude difference between Esther and Vashti, and how he loved Esther, and in that love he gave royal gifts to everyone. He gave them a tax break, and it's almost the difference between a man who's puffed up with pride, trying to show everyone his greatness, versus a man who's giving gifts. Kind of a reversal in his attitude.
Yeah, and it seems like it's more about Esther than it is about him. Gerald?
Yeah, she's making a great point. And what's so amazing about this is that Esther changed his life. Yep. All these women he had, and he loved her more, and he gave her a banquet like you were saying. She changed his life. And that's amazing. That's what made Esther so special. She was just such a great woman, that her presence, but then she changed this great king's life, who only cared about himself, it seemed like. And I don't know how much time was here, but in a short period of time, he loved her and wanted to honor her, not just use her as this is just a woman. This is the lady I love. This is my queen. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, great point. In verses 19 and 20, it says, let me see how much time I have. Okay. We've got just the last few verses to cover. In verses 19 and 20, it says, now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. We see another instance of him being at the king's gate. Kind of like Gerald said, it's almost like he's there checking to see on Esther, but it could have also implied that he was an official of the king. We don't know. And then it reiterates in verse 20 that Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, kind of wrapping up this section of the story that started out with Mordecai saying, don't tell anyone who you are, and then it ends with don't tell anyone. She didn't tell anyone who she was. So it kind of closes this section of the Esther's rise to queenship. And then from here we see through the book the things that happen while Esther is queen. So we'll go ahead and get into the last few verses. So it says, in those days as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. We'll pick up in chapter 3 on Sunday. Just a couple comments really quick that are interesting on this section. Of course, this story right here will resonate in chapter 6. We'll see the fruition of what happens here in chapter 6, and it's what turns the whole story around. So we'll pick up with chapter 3 on Sunday. Thank you for your comments and participation.